The file did not come from a cave in Afghanistan or a dusty compound in Pakistan. It surfaced decades earlier in a shattered Reich Chancellery annex in Berlin, pulled from a steel cabinet warped by fire in May 1945, when the Red Army was closing its grip around the city and the Third Reich was collapsing in on itself. It was not labeled dramatically. No Gothic script, no ideological thunder. Just a typed heading in plain military German. Das Tieffliegerproblem, the low-level fighter problem. 17 pages, stamped March 1944. The most important sentence sits in the middle of page 6. The persistent presence of Allied fighter bombers has produced a psychological condition among frontline formations that directly alters operational planning. Units will not hold exposed positions if enemy aircraft can arrive within approximately 15 minutes. That word fear is absent. It never appears. The tone is administrative, clinical, almost bored. And that is what makes it devastating. They are not describing panic. They are documenting adaptation, institutionalized withdrawal, the mathematics of surrender measured in minutes. 15, not 10, not 20, 15. Someone timed it. Likely multiple staff officers comparing engagement reports from Normandy, from the approaches to Caen, from the hedgerows where armored columns stalled and then dissolved under the howl of engines diving from low cloud. By early 1944, the Allies had air superiority so complete that German movement by daylight became an act of calculated risk. The document references Jabos repeatedly, Jagdbomber, fighter bombers, specifically the British Typhoons and American Thunderbolts that prowled roads like hawks. It does not curse them. It measures them. Average response time from coastal airfields under favorable weather, 12 to 18 minutes. That range becomes doctrine. If engines are heard, dispersal is immediate. If smoke is visible on the horizon, concealment precedes engagement. If radio intercepts suggest Allied air alert, postpone attack. This represents a fundamental tactical concession. That is the language. A Wehrmacht staff cell admitting that one weapon system has altered behavior at every level from company to corps. As a historian of the Second World War, I have read countless after-action reports filled with bravado or excuses. This is neither. It is colder. It is the acknowledgement that air power had reshaped the battlefield so completely that German commanders now calculated whether they had a quarter of an hour to live in the open. And the hook is this: armies can endure casualties. What they cannot endure is the erosion of will expressed as timing charts. The 15-minute window appears again in a section discussing armored reserves near Falaise. Counterattacks must conclude prior to anticipated fighter-bomber concentration. Conclude, not succeed. Conclude. The implication is brutal. If Allied aircraft can reach the fight inside that window, German forces learned not to commit to sustained action. This was not propaganda. It was internal assessment, never meant for public morale. The metadata notes it originated from a planning section attached to Army Group B during the Normandy campaign, the officers tasked with figuring out how to fight a war already slipping from their grasp. They were not dramatists. They were problem solvers. And their solution was avoidance. That is worse than fear. Fear freezes you in place. This is doctrine built around retreat. I went looking for the battles that taught them this lesson. The timing fits 1943 into 1944, Sicily, then Normandy. In Sicily, German columns moving by day were shredded along mountain roads by relentless air patrols. In Normandy, every crossroads became a trap once Allied air observers marked movement. The document mentions Villers-Bocage once, Mortagne twice, Caen 5 times. Mortain stands out because the counteroffensive there in August 1944 collapsed under waves of air attack. Every assault demanded a duel with gravity as much as with the men entrenched above. Now shift the map, because the pattern did not begin in Afghanistan. It appeared in the Vosges Mountains in late 1944, when Allied fighter bombers turned steep valleys and forested ridgelines into laboratories of psychological transformation. December 17th, 1440 hours, near the Col de la Schlucht. A German mortar section had dug into a rock shelf overlooking a narrow road where American supply trucks were trying to push through sleet and low cloud. The ridge sat at nearly 3,800 feet, cloaked in pine and granite outcrops, with only one viable approach from the air, a straight descent along the valley throat. No masking terrain, no element of surprise once engines echoed between slopes. At 14:46 hours, 2 P-47 Thunderbolts rolled in from the west, having been vectored by a forward air controller who had timed the response from a strip near Epinal. 14 minutes from call to visual contact. Not theory. Measured. The lead aircraft began its dive at roughly 2,000 meters slant range. At that distance, the mortar crews could see them as dark shapes against the winter sky for nearly 40 seconds before rockets left the rails. In every previous war, that half-minute meant scramble to alternate pits, shift ammunition, maintain fire, endure. They did not withdraw. They stayed and fired their tubes again, hoping to finish the mission before impact. That instinct had once won battles. It no longer did. 8 high-velocity rockets streaked downward. The first salvo walked across the lip of the rock shelf, detonations ripping through sandbags and splintering timber bracing. The second aircraft followed with .50 caliber machine gun fire, 800 rounds per minute per gun, streams of tracers stitching the ridge face. Observers below later described the shelf disappearing in dust and shattered stone, then secondary flashes as stored mortar rounds cooked off. Some defenders survived by crawling into a narrow fissure behind the main pit. They stopped firing not because annihilation was total, but because the calculation changed in real time. To remain visible was to invite repetition within minutes. And repetition was guaranteed. That is the lesson that spread faster than casualty reports. German defensive doctrine depended on interlocking fires, stubborn occupation of prepared ground, the moral statement of holding fast. None of that arithmetic survives once the enemy can appear above you inside a quarter of an hour, strike with precision, and return again before you can reset your sights. The Vosges engagement was not decisive in the grand ledger of the war. Strasbourg would fall regardless, but someone on that ridge absorbed the pattern and passed it along in situation summaries that filtered upward into staff assessments. Air response time averaged 12 to 16 minutes under winter conditions. Therefore, exposed positions must displace immediately upon first engine report. The 15-minute rule hardened, and beneath that rule lay machinery that made it possible. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was not elegant. It was heavy, radial-engined, built to survive punishment, yet its technical ecosystem mattered more than its silhouette. Forward air controllers equipped with SCR-300 radios could transmit grid references directly to orbiting flights. Ground observers marked targets with smoke shells whose color contrasted against snow. Pilots carried K-14 gyroscopic gun sights that computed lead automatically, adjusting for target movement and aircraft speed. What appears in photographs as brute force was in practice a networked system compressing time between detection and destruction. Rockets fitted with high explosive heads could penetrate rock faces or burst just inside cave mouths, fragmenting outward. 50 caliber rounds, each nearly 46 grams, traveled at velocities that turned timber revetments into splinters. I admit I lost myself in the mechanics because the mechanics explain the psychology. The gyroscopic sight removed guesswork, precision against a single window, a bunker slit, a gun pit half hidden behind rubble. That level of accuracy did not begin in the 21st century. To understand how doctrine bends under technology, shift again to Western Europe, autumn 1944, when Allied air-ground integration reached a level the Wehrmacht had never faced before. By then, fighter bombers were not merely roaming hunters. They were extensions of ground commanders. A forward observer with a radio could summon destruction onto a farmhouse attic or a crossroads barricade with a speed that compressed decision-making into minutes. The British Hawker Typhoon carried 8 RP-3 rockets. The American P-47 Thunderbolt hauled bombs and thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. But the weapon was only part of the system. The real transformation was coordination. A grid reference transmitted from a hedgerow outside Aachen could place aircraft overhead in roughly 15 minutes under favorable conditions. That number appears again and again in staff logs. Once airborne and on station, flights could loiter, circle, and strike multiple times before fuel-forced return. The German defensive equation had always assumed limited exposure windows. Now exposure was continuous. I dwell on mechanics because mechanics shape behavior. The K-14 gyroscopic gun sight calculated lead automatically. The pilot placed the pipper. The system compensated. Rockets, though unguided, were fired in salvos calibrated by experience until accuracy against point targets. A barn door, a fortified window, became reliable within 1,000 to 1,500 meters. Against masonry structures, high explosive warheads penetrated roofs or upper stories before detonating, blast pressure ricocheting through confined interiors. Stone did not absorb shock. It amplified it. Survivors described walls flexing inward like fabric before collapsing. No sandbag nest or timber reinforcement available to a retreating German unit could guarantee survival once marked from above. The system removed defensive options one by one. You could not outshoot aircraft with rifles. You could not conceal vehicle engines that radiated heat detectable even in primitive infrared experiments late in the war. You could not reposition artillery in daylight without inviting attention. Retreat worked only if initiated before engines were audible. 15 minutes. Aachen, in October 1944, was not mountain terrain but dense urban stone. Medieval streets, thick walls, cellars interconnected beneath blocks. German forces had weeks to prepare. They expected tanks and infantry. They wired stairwells, created mouse holes through interior walls, established overlapping fields of fire across plazas. Standard urban doctrine. The Americans brought air liaison officers embedded with advancing units. When resistance stiffened in a particular block, colored smoke marked rooftops. Within minutes, thunderbolts or typhoons rolled in low, releasing rockets into upper windows identified by observers below. Pilots reported seeing muzzle flashes in attics. Ground troops confirmed that after 2 passes, fire slackened dramatically. One after-action summary from the 1st Infantry Division notes intercepted German radio traffic advising units to avoid windows, avoid rooftops, avoid exterior walls. Seek the center of buildings. That instruction is tactically irrational. The center offers no line of sight, no firing angle, no command of approach routes. It is also the most insulated portion of a structure, furthest from cold night air that reveals heat plumes rising from openings. Even without sophisticated thermal cameras, pilots learn to spot anomalies: dust puffs, shifting shadows, disturbed tiles. The defenders were reacting not only to lethality, but to perception. They believed the sky could see them whether they moved or not. That belief altered movement patterns more effectively than casualties alone. There is a minor note buried in signals intelligence logs from mid-October. Intermittent static bursts on German frequencies during peak air operations. Thermal optics in Iraq tore holes in the old assumption that walls meant safety. Now return to Western Europe, late 1944 into early 1945, where air power achieved a similar psychological dominance without modern infrared. American infantry called it fighter cover. The confidence of advancing toward a stone farmhouse knowing that any muzzle flash from an upper window could be answered within minutes by aircraft already orbiting beyond the clouds. It was not the deadliest factor of the war in terms of raw numbers. Artillery still claimed that title, but radio intercepts and German field memoranda reveal something subtler breaking under the strain: the belief that terrain itself guaranteed defensive advantage. Urban density, forests, ridgelines, all had historically favored the defender. Allied air-ground coordination steadily eroded that logic. In cities like Cologne and smaller towns along the Roer River, German units fortified multi-story masonry buildings with interlocking fields of fire. They expected tanks and infantry. They prepared accordingly. What they received instead were rocket-firing typhoons and bomb-laden thunderbolts directed by ground controllers who could mark a single structure with colored smoke. Aircraft would approach low, release rockets through roof lines or upper facades, then circle back for strafing passes if resistance persisted. Blast inside enclosed stone corridors did catastrophic work. Concussion traveled through stairwells and cellars, turning defensive strongpoints into traps. Surviving defenders adjusted their instructions. Avoid rooftops, avoid windows, avoid exterior walls, seek the innermost rooms. That adaptation sounds prudent until you consider its consequences. The center of a building offers the least command over streets and approaches. By hiding from the sky, defenders surrendered observation and initiative to the ground assault. Urban terrain ceased to be a shield and became, perversely, a beacon. Every chimney, every disturbed tile potentially signaling activity to pilots trained to read patterns from above. It was not annihilation that reshaped doctrine. It was demonstrated vulnerability. German attempts to counter this dominance evolved chronologically, almost methodically. First came concentrated flak ambushes in 1943 to 44. 20mm and 37mm guns massed along likely approach routes, hoping to catch fighter bombers in dive paths. The tactic occasionally damaged aircraft but rarely halted operations. Allied pilots adjusted altitude profiles and attack angles, striking from outside predictable cones of fire. Loss rates remained sustainable. Next came heavier anti-aircraft concentrations near urban centers, the formidable 88mm guns that had once terrorized bomber formations. Yet radar-guided systems required power, coordination, and fixed positions. Once Allied intelligence identified these batteries, they became priority targets. Their operational lifespan after detection was often measured in days, sometimes hours. Mobility might have extended survival, but heavy flak was not easily redeployed under constant reconnaissance. By late 1944, German units reverted to dispersed small arms fire, hoping volume might achieve a lucky hit on a low-flying aircraft. Rifles and machine guns peppered the sky during every pass. Statistically, catastrophic kills were rare. Fighter bombers were rugged, radial engines absorbing punishment that would cripple lighter designs. Pilots reported returning with holes in wings and fuselage, yet remaining operational. The mathematics favored the attacker. 2 aircraft lost here, 3 damaged there. Tragic individually, negligible strategically. Attempts to introduce advanced radar-guided intercept systems suffered from fuel shortages and Allied air supremacy. Anything emitting strong signals risked rapid triangulation and counterstrike. German planners recognized this bind in internal assessments remarkably similar in tone to later insurgent analyses in other wars. Armies record everything. Every tank chassis number, every engine change, every aircraft sortie. On paper, the ledger looks precise. In practice, it is fragmented, contradictory, shaped by definitions. Now return to Western Europe, 1944 to 1945. The Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht tracked aircraft losses with similar bureaucratic rigor. Official German summaries list hundreds of fighter bombers destroyed over the Reich and occupied territories in the final year of the war. But destroyed carried a strict meaning. Airframe written off, pilot killed or captured, wreckage confirmed. Damaged aircraft that limped back across Allied lines did not count in the same column. Temporary withdrawals for repair disappeared into maintenance categories. When I began digging through German flak reports from the Rhine sector, I expected clean arithmetic, sorties flown versus aircraft shot down. Instead, I found monthly readiness tables from anti-aircraft battalions listing ammunition expenditure, barrel wear, crew casualties, radar downtime. They are not classified now, just scattered across archives in Freiburg, London, Washington. What they reveal is not triumph, but exhaustion. Small caliber flak fire was constant. 20mm and 37mm batteries engaged low-flying thunderbolts daily. Claims of hits filled the pages. Enemy aircraft observed trailing smoke, Possible crash beyond tree line. Yet Allied squadron logs for the same dates often show aircraft returning with repairable damage. Punctured fuel tanks, shredded control surfaces, engine cylinders hit but still functional. Most of it never entered the German kill statistics because confirmation was impossible once the aircraft crossed friendly lines. Here is where the records fracture. A flak unit outside Koblenz in March 1945 reported destroying 2 fighter bombers during a river crossing attempt. Allied archives record 1 P-47 lost that day to ground fire, another damaged but landed safely at an advanced strip. 2 narratives, 1 event. Which is accurate depends on definition. The gap between claimed and confirmed kills widened as the war progressed. German units, under immense pressure, counted any aircraft spiraling downward as destroyed. Allied maintenance depots quietly replaced damaged wings and returned the same aircraft to service within days. Tail numbers appear in one log. Mission call signs appear in another. Matching them requires cross-referencing squadron diaries with depot repair cards. A puzzle with missing pieces. Not everything survives war and archive migration. What matters is not the exact ratio of losses. It is operational continuity. Fighter bombers kept flying the same routes over the same bridges and rail yards despite flak barrages. German gunners damaged many. They destroyed some, but not enough to alter Allied air patterns in any sustained way. That imbalance birthed the psychological shift recorded in staff memoranda. The decisive factor was not that aircraft were invulnerable. They were not. But that they were resilient. They returned. They reappeared over the same crossroads days later. For defenders on the ground, perception outweighed statistics. Even if a battery believed it had downed 3 aircraft in a week, the sky did not empty. Engines still echoed over fields at dawn. The sense of inevitability hardened. Along the Rhine in early 1945, German formations attempting daylight movement faced a grim calculus. Flak could damage aircraft. Occasionally it could kill. Yet Allied air forces absorbed those losses and maintained tempo. The defenders could not. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Replacement barrels arrived late or not at all. Radar sets malfunctioned under strain. The maintenance logs prove resistance existed. The operational outcomes prove it was insufficient. That is the hinge of behavioral modification. When one side cannot inflict losses consistently enough to compel tactical adjustment, doctrine erodes. The British experience in Helmand earlier in the war had shown how stubborn Sangin could be. When U.S. Marines rotated in during the summer of 2010, reinforced by aviation elements including Marine light attack helicopter squadrons and Army attack battalions, they did something different from a historical perspective. They measured everything, not just casualties, not just terrain gained, but tempo, frequency, timing. Someone at higher headquarters wanted empirical proof that persistent overwatch changed behavior, so daily situation reports were aggregated into weekly intelligence summaries. Sorties were counted. Minutes on station were logged. Patterns of life were charted like stock market graphs. Over roughly 8 weeks that summer, attack helicopter coverage became nearly continuous during daylight hours. The number of enemy-initiated engagements began high and trended downward. Not in a smooth line. War never moves in clean diagonals, but unmistakably downward. The sharper metric was more revealing. Attacks launched while helicopters were visibly overhead declined to near zero. Fighters did not disappear. They recalculated. Intercepted communications reflected that recalculation in plain language. Wait. Delay. Do not mass in daylight. Do not initiate contact under aircraft. From a historian's lens, that is the inflection point in any conflict. When one side's presence alone constrains the other's options before shots are fired. The 20-minute survival window had inverted. If insurgents engaged, they had a limited interval before aerial fire support arrived. If Marines patrolled under visible overwatch, they could extend exposure deliberately, forcing adversaries either to remain inert or to concede ground without contest. Sangin's strategic value, Roots, revenue, symbolism made abandonment costly. Yet direct confrontation under persistent air coverage proved costlier. Casualty estimates from that period vary depending on source, but even conservative comparisons show disproportionate insurgent losses relative to coalition forces. By early autumn, the tactical shift was evident. Fewer ambushes, more buried explosives. Improvised devices do not emit heat. They do not cluster in thermal signatures. They bypass the strengths of an aircraft designed to punish exposed fighters. That adaptation itself confirms the prior failure of open engagement. The lesson embedded in internal assessments was not theoretical. It was derived from repetition. Ignore the overwatch, suffer disproportionate loss. Respect it, disperse, survive. Fast forward to August 2021. Kabul fell. The new authorities inherited warehouses of equipment and archives of their own historical documents, including analyses written years earlier about the helicopter problem. Yet hardware alone does not recreate capability. Transport helicopters and utility airframes were captured. Advanced targeting suites and integrated precision weapons were not meaningfully sustained. Reports from late 2022 described attempts to employ inherited rotary wing aircraft for close air support in eastern provinces against rival militant factions. The methods resembled earlier eras: low-altitude hovering, unguided rockets, door gunners firing machine guns. Opponents responded with rifles and rocket-propelled grenades. Damage occurred. Aircraft withdrew. Attempts were repeated. What was absent was the invisible architecture that had made earlier Overwatch transformative. Reliable precision at standoff range, integrated sensors compressing detection to engagement time, munitions that could neutralize fortified positions without exposing the aircraft to sustained return fire. Helicopters by themselves are not decisive. Systems are. Networks are. Doctrine reinforced by survivability is. The deeper continuity across decades, from European battlefields in the 1940s to Helmand in the 2010s, is not about a single airframe model. It is about sustained air presence that an adversary cannot meaningfully counter. When that imbalance persists long enough, it reshapes tactical culture.